Well, but it's the nature of the procession. If you proceed from the source that is a father, then you must be a son and an only son because of the nature of a procession. Have you ever heard the word procession?
Well, you see, the word responsible, it's in the word. Response. Able. You have to be able to respond. Part of what moral responsibility is.
This isn't even my final song! But this is to go even further beyond!
Have you paid heed to the prefix pro in the word procession?
It's just gonna be stuff like that. Like it doesn't.
Okay, if you guys are ready, we can hop into it. Sully, are you ready?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Should I go first here?
Yeah.
Okay. So, so the topic is something that we discussed previously. It's this thesis about analogical predication. The way I'm understanding the thesis is that when we make predications about God, they are analogical, meaning that the predicate that we assign is not one that assigns to God in the same way that it assigns to other things. It has a different meaning when it's assigned to God. However, there's supposed to be some component that's understood by using the same predicate through analogy. And typically speaking, the common objection is just to say, well, there must be a common property between the two analogs for an analogy to hold. The typical proponent of analogical predication in this context will say that even the common property itself is analogical in the same way as the predicate we started with. So analogical predication is contrasted with univocal predication and equivocal predication. Univocal typically is taken to be the same predicate with the same meaning, whether assigned to A or B, two different things. Equivocal predication would be to say that there's some sense in which the predicate, whether expressed as a term or some kind of semiotic device, is the same, but the meaning is actually different, and in an unrelated sense. Whereas with this third category of analogical predication, the predicates are understood to have a different meaning, but to have some relationship, so they aren't wholly distinct in meaning. So this is the way that these are typically presented. I have a few arguments against thinking that all of the predicates that assign to God must be understood analogically. The basic argument is that to form an intentional relation, which is an aboutness relation, to say that my sentence or my predication is about God, is to have a property of God stand in a relation in the same way that the predication does. Or you might not want to use property language here. You might want to say something true of God stands in the relation in the same way that the predication itself does. And basically the horns here is that if you accept that, then you're saying that there's something true of God that's also true of something else in a univocal sense. Or you deny that, in which case the intentional relation breaks down and this predication is not about God because the thing which is about and the predication itself don't stand in the relation in a univocal way. I think this is probably where Jimmy has like some criticism, so we probably get into the details of that response. But Jimmy can also give like an intro for how he looks at analogical predication, I guess, and if he thinks I'm mischaracterizing it or anything like that.
Yeah, so I think we're going to disagree importantly, but I'm not sure what the entailments are going to be, is on the nature of analogy and predication in general, I think. So, like, to take maybe a historical approach to this, theologians are very interested in this topic because it's a mainstay of traditional Orthodox Christianity to say that God is holy, to look at passages in the Bible and see that he transcends human categories. And that's to say that, God isn't just higher or better or more powerful than things in human experience, but he's categorically removed from them. He's on a totally different level of power. He's on a totally different level of goodness. And so we can't compare them by using the same metaphysical tools, or by maybe a better word is by appealing to the same metaphysical tools as when we compare other things, such as when we analogize other things. This is mainly a metaphysical problem. It's not a problem of language first. It may become a problem of language after the metaphysical question, but the metaphysical question is really what is going on with God and creation, such that our predication about Him, such that the statements we make about God are truth functional. So, they actually manage to truthfully or falsely describe what He's like. How do they land like that? How do they find purchase? Analogical predication is answering that question. It's not, at least within theological philosophy. So it's not after the question like a person has to mean the same. He has to have the same intentional content when he uses words about God. It's kind of leaving that question alone. That question I think is more complicated. But the question that the theologian is after, or the philosophical theologian, is when we use terms of God, especially, and to highlight the problem, when we use terms that we use for things that are not God, what is going on in the world that makes that language find purchase? And analogy is supposed to be something that God does or has, or some kind of relation that God holds to the world generally, that doesn't involve common properties or common metaphysical stuff, to use a very simplistic term, in order to have common terms applied to him. We have common terms, we have common predicates, but we don't have common metaphysical things grounding the meaning of those statements. So that's what I take to be analogy. And so I think there's going to be some difference about approaches to like what's going on when we say there's like analogical predication in theology.
Okay, so I think I want to agree that it's not going to be a linguistic problem. I kind of want to get that off the table here. I think that predication can be understood as a linguistic act, or a speech act, but it could also be understood as the formation of propositions which are non-linguistic. So we could just be talking about what they mean, devoid of a language. And you could think about representing that in first order logic, or you could do a couple different things to visualize that. You might still think that's like linguistic as well. But the point is that you can basically strip out just the truth bearers, and we can work with those. So the idea here is that you're saying that there's a relationship between the predicates as assigned to God and as assigned to other things in the world that doesn't indicate any kind of metaphysical similarity between them. And that seems to be a point you want to highlight. And so I think, without getting into linguistic analysis to say why applying the same term in two different cases is going to give you additional information about God when it doesn't signal any kind of metaphysical similarity whatsoever, is going to be the point that I'm mainly addressing here. So I think this is, again, like highlighted in the arguments that I wrote. I don't know if Truthy's going to somehow post them, but the idea here is that if a statement is about God, right, then you just automatically, when you say that, you have this intentional relation. You have this structure of A is about B. Now, presumably that's something you're going to want to preserve. You're going to want to say that the statements that we make are about God, right? Because even this thesis is a statement about God. When you say God can only be predicated of analogically, you're saying something about God. And so if I can get to the point where I'm showing that this relationship can't hold, or I show you that a statement you make cannot be about God, then the thesis is going to be self-undermining, right? It's going to be like self-defeating in that way. But if you do accept that that they stand in the relation in the same way, then it's going to be true of some feature of God that it stands in this relation, and it's also going to be true of the predication, whether that's a sort of mental item or a linguistic item, is also standing in this relation. So you have this property that's shared, which is standing in this intentional relation. And so that's the property that I'm interested in pointing out must be held univocally, right? Because if it's not, then you're going to get into this self-defeat problem.
Yeah, so I think there's a disagreement about whether something about the standing in relation being a common metaphysical element. But before I jump onto that, I just want to say that it sounds like you're explaining the first formal argument that you have posted. Maybe you wanted to read that, but if that's what you're explaining, and I think you are, that is a great explanation. I happen to agree with at least most of that. You're basically just saying, for people who aren't maybe as philosophically inclined, hey, when we say things about God, the key word there is about. So what is making that? What is giving the sentence that aboutness? Whatever's doing that, that's going to be the univocal element that we were trying to avoid in the first place. So by saying there's no univocal element, we're denying that any sentences can be about God. And that just means when I say, God, something like God can't be univocally predicated, that's just not to talk about God anymore on my position. Did you say that's fair?
Yes, yeah, I think that's right so far. I did just want to point out too that if we're getting into the sort of truth maker, right, for the intentional relation, you're asking like what makes it true that it's about this, right? At least minimally, part of that is its truth conditions, which include that the two relata. So it's a relation. It's a two-part relation. A is about B. A and B are the relata. It's going to be true of both of those relata that they stand in that relation, and that's sort of a minimal condition for it to be true that some statement or even thought is about God.
Right. So I think the simple contention for the philosophical theologians that I'm talking about is that there's two different ways that something could stand in this relation. And in other words, there are two different truth makers for the statement that a sentence bears that relation. One truth maker is that the things share a common property, or they share some kind of common metaphysical feature if you don't like properties. But something is going on where the things that are compared in an analogy, or the common predicates that are shared by two different things, the truth maker of the statement that makes use of that common predicate is going to be the common property. So there's this kind of isometric relation between common predicates, common properties. So what the idea of analogy is that the truth maker of the statement that the sentence is about God, say, is not a common feature between God and something else in the world or whatever. And you can give different theories. Someone might be a Mysterian about how God is able to do that. My pet Calvinistic theory is that when we look in Scripture, we see God do this act of condescension where he takes on characteristics to himself that are not essentially his. They don't belong to him intrinsically, but he voluntarily associates himself with them purposefully for the sake of giving us an experience of what he's like. And so the truth maker of the aboutness relation that we're on about here are these special acts that God does where he takes on a property that is not originally his. So we can say, on the one hand, yes, the property is associated with God in the right way, or the property is assumed by God. So it might be common in that sort of accidental sense. But yet, God doesn't have that property. Essentially, he doesn't have a common metaphysical feature in and of himself. And so there is no univocism there where in other cases, things essentially have, things in and of themselves have these common properties, have laws in common, or have some other metaphysical feature in common.
Okay, so I think if you want to sort of segregate God's attributes into the sui generis attributes that are essential and these accidental attributes that can actually stand or actually do have common properties and so can stand in the relation. The question is now, we could talk about God's accidental properties, right? We've solved that issue, but now it becomes an issue when you want to talk about the sui generis properties, one of which just is this sort of nature of being sui generis in this way. So the point is that when you talk about that, we also want that to be true, right?
Well, I think that maybe misunderstands the strategy here. So the strategy isn't to sort of like regress or back up into new categories, but rather to say, hey, the whole field of theology is undergirded by this truth maker of theological predication. All of them, even the statements about God's sui generisness, have the same truth maker, no different than the statements about his condescension. So it just seems to me like we would have to investigate what argument there is that, I'm assuming it's going to be something like that. Hey, that metaphysical theory doesn't work. It doesn't succeed in offering us a truth maker for the aboutness. And or it's going to have to say the theory unintentionally commits us to univocism.
Yeah, so for a couple of points here is that I'm not really interested in sort of singular truth makers for these aboutness relations. I'm more just interested in satisfying some of the minimal conditions, which are, that the relata stand in the relation and so on. Like those are before you even get to some kind of satisfaction of the truth condition, those are minimal requirements to sort of form the intentional relations. And I think that the thesis itself, again, is about these properties that are sui generis or can only be predicated of analogically. That's what you might want to say, like, again, that there are certain properties God has that are accidental properties. And maybe you want to say those can be univocally predicated of, okay. But that must be secondary to this thesis about analogical predication then, right? Because we want to maintain that thesis with respect to the sui generis properties. So if there is some property that God has that nothing else has, right, which is something you're asserting, then the point is that to talk about that or to make that assertion or even to just have the thought or belief with that as its content, right? It has to be the case that it's about the property, and the property is then standing in the relation to the predication that is about it, right? So if A is the predication and B is the property that God has, they both stand in the relation in the same way. And I can say of A that it stands in the relation, and I can say of B that it stands in this relation. And so it's just going to be true, of some sui generis property of God. There's something true about that property that's also true of this predication. Now maybe what you want to say is that in any like invocation of an aboutness relation, there's already this like condescension that's happened, right? But then it would just seem to indicate that you don't need this thesis about analogical predication. God has made it such that you can univocally predicate of him, and why wouldn't he be able to do that, right?
That's a little confusing. So let's start with that last question. That's a little confusing me just because the idea of analogical predication, as it's understood within the context of philosophical theology, just is the thesis that these statements can stand in this intentional relation without a truth maker like a common property. That's just what it means to be analogical predication. So to say, so to ask the question, why would we need analogical predication if God can condescend to us? Is just to say, why would we need God to condescend to us if we need God to? That's exactly the same thing. Condescension, just there is a instantiation of an analogical predicate theory, or an analogy theory, whatever we want to call it. I think the issue is this is my understanding, so I could be wrong here, but I think that like the target of our dispute is getting mixed up. I don't have a problem with saying that all of theological predication includes a property, namely this aboutness relation, or includes I don't know how you would want to think of relations as different from properties or predicates, whatever, but however you catch out relations, it seems to me that it's not in contest at all with what theologians are after with analogical predication. Excuse me. To say that all theological predications possess this relation to God, and God is in that relation too. That's not really the issue. The question is, why do they stand in that relation? What is the metaphysical thing that's undergirding that relation? What would be univocal is if the thing that's undergirding that relation is some common metaphysical feature. So as long as I can say, and I do say, that all of these statements which stand in an intentional relation do not stand in that relation because of a common metaphysical feature, but they stand in that relation because of some special activity that God has done in order to enable the things in the world to speak about him. Then it just seems to me like I've satisfied showing how actually everything we say is in a sense analogical about God, or presupposes some kind of analogical backdrop. And it at that point, I'm not sure what the difficulty is supposed to be.
Sure. So, okay. I understand, like, there you may want to draw distinctions between like linguistics and metaphysics or something like that. But I think again, like, so what I'm going for here are like minimal conditions for any sort of intentional relation to hold. And, you could be a nominalist about this relation. You don't have to think that it actually has like some ontos to it or a metaphysical import or anything like that, right? So you could think, you could just think in terms of things that are true, right? Um, so it's true of God that he has a property or a feature that stands in the relation, in this aboutness relation, right? And it's true of the statement that's about him that it has a property or feature that stands in the relation. And the point that I'm driving towards here is that has to be univocal, right? When you say that also is just going to be analogical, the point is that it's then strictly speaking false that they stand in this relation. It's strictly speaking not the case that this and this stand in this relation in the same sense. And so the relation can't even get off the ground. And this is why you get into the self-defeat problem, which says that if you accept this thesis, it just commits you to the fact that none of your statements are actually about God. And the thesis itself is like ostensibly a statement about God. So it can't be true. Right. And that's like now you seem to just be saying, look, all that analogical predication says is that there's not a common property. Like, what don't you get? Right. But the point is that if there isn't such a common property, you can't form the relations, right? It's false that those relations hold in a strict sense, right? It's just false that this stands in the same relation as that, right? I mean, if you're actually equivocating there and you mean two different things, right? Then when you try to hold the meanings fixed, it's false. You agree with me there, right?
I wish that I could, Sully, but I think that's where the line is crossed from the metaphysical to the language. Like what I mean is should be really irrelevant to the issue, right?
Well, again, it's like, so I think of meaning as being non-linguistic, you know. So when I say meaning, I'm not talking about something linguistic.
Okay, so let me see if I understand you. Would it be fair to say that you're asking me about the proposition? There's a proposition, and you're asking about whether it's true or truth functional or something like that, as opposed to like
In this case, the proposition is
what
that A is about B.
right. So now that I know that's what you're asking, can you? I apologize. Can you go back and ask the question again?
Yeah. So so it's not so much a question. I guess I may have like left off with a question here, but the point is that the relation A is about B can be treated as a proposition. And in that sense, when we say that one thing is about another thing, the minimal truth conditions for that proposition are that the two relata both stand in the relation. Right now, we haven't even gotten into assessing the rest of the truth conditions as to whether or not the relata are such that the relation holds. But before we even get there, we have to say that they stand in the relation. They both stand in this same relation. And if you can't say that, then you can't form the relation. And if you tried to hold the meanings fixed of what it means, so you say A stands in this relation. I used A, B, and C. So the relation itself is called C. That's the proposition. A is about B. And if you said A stands in relation C and B stands in relation C, right? That's the predicate that has to be univocal, because if it can't be univocally maintained, then it's not true that A and B stand in the same relation.
I'm not sure which of these. I can only think of two ways to approach this clearly, but I'm not sure which one is more progressive. So let me start this way, and we'll give it a shot. So I actually agree with pinning this as an issue of the proposition, like hey, A is about B, or the proposition theological predication are just those sentences that are about God. So they possess this aboutness. They're in that intentional relation. That I don't have a disagreement with. So the difficulty I have is when it's stated, and I'm not quoting you. I don't mean to quote you here exactly, but I'm paraphrasing you. When you say sentences like, if there's no univocism, which I take to mean if there's no common metaphysical feature, or if there's no common property, or something like that, something in the same ballpark, then the relation can't hold. But that just seems to me to be the most controversial premise of the argument.
Well, maybe again, I could go back and say that you could take what it means to say that A stands in the relation to not be indicative of some metaphysical feature, right? You could be, again, like some kind of nominalist about the relation itself, but like hold that it's still true or false, right? And so the point is that A, when we say A stands in the relation, it's this stands in the relation predicate that I'm focusing on, right? And it doesn't have to signal a metaphysical feature, right? It's just that it's true of both things in the same way, right? So it's true of A and it's true of B, and in the same way, univocally. But you don't necessarily have to interpret that as like some ontological or metaphysical commitment, right? It's just that it's true, right? It's true of both things. And that's what, when I started out like expressing what univocal predication is, in a typical sense, it's when I can say of X, a certain predicate, and I can say of Y a certain predicate, and the predicate in both cases has the same meaning, right?
Right, they express the same proposition.
Well, no, they wouldn't. So you should think of it this way: like assigned to different objects, it's not the same proposition. So if I said the ball is red and the truck is red, right? Those are two different propositions. They just contain the same predicate, and I may actually mean that in a univocal sense, like they're the same color.
Right, but sorry. So I'm saying the predicate they are the same color can be. That's the predicate. That's the proposition I'm after being expressed. That's the one that's so.
Right. So to go back to it, it
Yeah,
stands in the relation. That's really what we want to target here, and we're talking about the A is about B intentional relation here. So we're saying the predicate stands in the relation is the one that I'm saying has to be univocal.
So that's another statement that I think, like when you use the word analogical, it's like if you could, let's just ask you to spell out what that means. Like when you say it has to be univocal, can you replace that word with a spelled out meaning of what univocal is, so we can see?
Yeah, I mean, so again, what it means is that when applied to A and when applied to B, it means the same in both cases. It means the same thing. It expresses the same predicate, not in a equivocal sense where the, you know, the device, the symbol is the same, but the meaning is different, and not in an analogical sense where the meanings are partially the same, but there's some distinction between them. It's like, no, we're saying that for this intentional relation, A is about B to hold. It has to be true of A that it stands in the relation in the same way that it's true of B that it stands in the relation. And if we varied the meanings, that would be fine. But then the point is that if I asked you to hold them fixed, right? If I said, well, if I asked you the way that A stands in this relation, let's just apply that meaning to B, right? You would say it's false that B stands in the relation in the same way as if I hold the meaning fixed with respect to A, right? And that's going to be the issue. You're going to say if it's analogical or equivocal that it doesn't mean the same thing when I say it about A compared to when I say it about B. And so, strictly speaking, it would be false that A is about B. The intentional relation would be false.
Yeah, man. So there's quite a few things here. I don't know. I don't know if this is too high a request, but if you can avoid the word meaning, because you and I think very differently about what that refers to. I don't think of meaning as something independent of like the linguistic question of how an agent is using a word. So
Yeah.
I think you're talking about propositions, but when you speak of meaning, I don't know how to replace what you're saying with propositions and it still come out to make any sense. That's the problem. That's like the trouble I'm running into is like, okay, well, if we just need it to be true that theological predication has this aboutness, and so the predicate and what the predicate is about stand in that one aboutness relation, that's fine. I accept that that's true, but I just don't think that that's what analogy is after. What analogy is after is asking the question, what makes that true? An analogy is saying, hey, it's the truth maker of that proposition is not a common metaphysical property. Or it's not nominalism or something like that. The truth maker of that property is something God's doing. It's some activity that he's after, or at least
Right. But again, like I don't want to go too. So I don't want to go too far into that though, because I feel like the point again is that I'm not talking about these metaphysical conditions for the relation to hold. I'm talking about like these minimal conceptual conditions, such as that the relata stand in the relation. That's not even getting into looking at the content of the relata to see if they're actually, if the sentence is actually true or not.
Can I ask you?
Those would be like the metaphysical considerations, right? Is that like we look at A and B, and from their sort of, let's say, metaphysical characteristics, we might decide that it's true or false. But before we even do that, we have to be able to say that there's a relation they stand in that we're analyzing, right?
So I honestly don't know what the conceptual conditions would be that are not metaphysical. What is that to you? Like when you say they stand in the same relation, that to me is not to talk about a condition.
Okay.
That's just to talk about
what do you
the thing for which there would be a condition.
Well, what do you think about like relations in general? And let's just break away from this. We'll come back to it in a second. But if I said like I have a hat on top of my head, right? This on top of relation is not something we, I mean, some people might want to, but I wouldn't want to say that it has like an on toss, right? That there's like an on top of fairy that grounds the on top of relation or anything like that. Now you might want to say like, look, ultimately everything that's true is true in virtue of God. That's fine. That's not super relevant though. So I think that again, like what I'm not targeting whether or not a specific instance of this kind of relation is true or false, right? So like you could come up with all kinds of specific instances of the A is about B. You could say like, this statement is about the Trinity, or this statement is about aseity or something like that, right? And presumably like those statements would be about God, and that's like the thing we're trying to focus on here is that in order for some predication, or like I said before when we were going a little bit into meaning versus linguistics, it could just be a thought. And maybe you think that thoughts are had in language, but I think you can potentially divorce those. If you're thinking about God, right, then the thought can be thought of as the first relatum. So it could be the thought is A, and B is whatever it is about God that you're thinking, right? And we want to say that that thing about God stands in this relation just as the thought stands in this relation. So we can say the same thing about that part of God that we're saying about this thought, right? And if we can't say that, then it's just not true that you're thinking about God.
Right. That's the part that I don't really understand. So there's two ways that I can think of to conceive of what's kind of the machinery of your intentionality or intentional relation talk. One way to interpret what you're saying is to say, and I'll use a metaphor here, right? Like if two people are in a house, they have to be in the house in the exact same way, or else they can't both be in the house. Well, no, it just seems to me like a person could be on one side of the house, another person could be on another side of the house. And in the same way, there could be very many asymmetrical relations. They would just be relations nonetheless. It's the house that's doing the work of putting the two things together, not that they stand in the same place in the house. It's the house. So that's one way to think of what you're saying, but it just seems like that would very easily do away with the objection or the argument or whatever, just because, hey, we can just think of the relation that God and these intentional statements stand in as asymmetrical. They do stand in one relation, but the way in which they participate in that relation is different. Now, the more interesting thing is just to say more directly that, look, every relation whatsoever, or at least every intentional relation, has to follow this rule that they can't participate in the relation in different ways. That would be cutting, right? That would destroy what the theologian is after with analogical predication, because now what you're saying is a metaphysical comment. Now you're saying, like, hey, the very objects that we can talk about all have to be structured in the universe in this intentional way. You might put it like that. They all have to be structured in a certain way according to the way we have intentional states about them. And it can only be this very specific way. But I don't know how you would motivate that claim. Like that seems to be the troubling claim. Which if it's part of your reasoning, suddenly everything makes perfect sense. But it also becomes really difficult to motivate. But if we take that away, I just don't see.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So yeah, when you're talking about like participating in the relation, it's fine to say that in a fairly obvious sense that the two relata do participate in this relation in a somewhat asymmetrical way, in that it's not some kind of bidirectional relation, right? It's saying A is about B. That's kind of already asymmetrical. We're not saying also B is about A. We're only So there's that aspect of it. So there's a simple sense in which it's obvious that relata are not they're not required to be identical unless we're talking about an identity or relation, right? But the point is that they at least both. It's true of both that they stand in that relation. And the question I think that you're pursuing here is like, well, they stand in the relation in different ways, right? Which is kind of what I think I keep sort of circling back to here, which is to say that, like, well, take the way, right, that A stands in the relation and apply it to B, right? And that's going to be false in the case of B, because what you're saying is that it can't be univocally predicated, and vice versa. So take the way in which B stands in the relation and apply it to A, and it's false, right? So in that sense, what I'm talking about is something much more minimal than what are the characteristics such that it would satisfy being in this place of a two-place relation. I'm just saying it's in the relation, right? It's much more broad. I'm not even targeting which place in the relation it stands in. I'm just saying it stands in the relation, period. And again, so if it's you get these two pairings, right, where you say, like, well, if I hold the meanings fixed, it's true of A and it's false of B, and vice versa. If I hold the meaning applied to B fixed, it's true of B and false of A, right? So I never get a situation in which it's true of both, right? And so again, to say that it stands in the relation in a different way, in some sense, is fine, but not in this like minimal sense. You know, I don't know if that's clear, but
Maybe. My issue is just like, hey, it just seems to face a dilemma. Like, if we're really just saying like, hey, these two things can participate in this relation differently, which then opens up the door to saying, hey, they participate analogically. That is, they participate not because they share a common metaphysical feature, but because God does something that provides the truth of the statement or the truth functionality of the statement, whatever, or its aboutness, whatever. Um, you know, that just takes away the teeth from the argument. So it just seems to me like, hey,
yeah,
I don't know.
but see, when you say that, it sounds like to me you're saying, well, God provides something that just makes it the case that they both stand in the relation. um, you know what I mean? Like when you say He provides the truth condition, like I'm just saying that's like a very minimal one. That's like outside of getting into the specifics of the what these relata actually are in a given case. You're saying God provides something such that it is the case that they both stand in this relation. You know, so I mean, I'm a little bit unclear, I guess, as to how you think it resolves this to say that God condescends and it makes this work. So like I don't know if you want to give me a little more detail about like how you think that even though they you seem to want to draw a very sharp distinction between quote unquote the ways that they stand in the relation and yet agree that it's true that they do, right? So I'm trying to get down to that little kernel of it's true that they both do, you know.
Yeah. So I mean, my position to light my cards is going to be something like, hey, the way predicates work in general is that they either attach to things, they either find purchased in what we're describing or referring or whatever because of common laws and common properties and those sorts of things that we rely on to individuate or classify things, or you're relying on God's divine act of condescension. Those are really the only two kinds of predications that exist. So, like going back to the hat on the head analogy, I have to admit, I maybe other people in the room got that. Maybe I'm dumb, but I just didn't get that seemed to me like something you were getting to that was important for your case, but I didn't understand it because to me, like when you talk about someone having a hat on their head, that proposition is made true by things like hats, the existence of space, the fact that you can have things in different positions in space, the fact that there can be a perspective on those positions. Like you have to have a lot of metaphysical baggage to make any sense of that predicate. It depends on a lot going on in the world. It's just the analogical predication is just saying, unlike all these other cases where you have common features and you've got these big laws like spatial nomology or something like that, controlling how these predicates work. In this case, you have something else. Um, you have God coming down to assume to himself predicates so that they can be an instrument or a mediator of knowledge of what he's like without them.
Yeah, right. But basically like the crux of this whole dialectic is how you do that, like how it forms this conduit. You might visualize it as like how do the analogies actually get you to something uh where then you could say yes, this is about God, right? Because all the way down in a sort of infinite regress we want to avoid ever talking about a common property, right? And there are just like I said at the beginning of this, there are just these very simple arguments that a common property is required, like dismissed. You know what I mean? But I'm trying to give you something more than that. Um, the point about the hat on my head example was to sort of quell sort of. I mean, you're right that it does have a bunch of these like presuppositions built in about space and like heads and hats and so on, of course, right? But it it underscores the idea. It's a sort of like third man like Plato argument, where it underscores this idea that um, in order for my hat to be on my head, sure, things like space and hats and heads have to exist, but there doesn't have to exist this like floating thing which is the on top of relation, right? I mean, you might think that that's like captured by all those other considerations in some way, um, but the point here is like I was just trying to explain that you don't have to commit to something to say that an aboutness relation is true, right? You wouldn't have to say it's some kind of entity that exists. You know, you don't have to give it too much import. So that was kind of the point of that example. But you can continue if you'd like with the.
I well, okay. So the reason it confuses me solely is because I'm on board with that. So I totally agree with you. I would disagree with nominalism, but I would agree that you don't have to be such a hardcore realist that you think for absolutely every predication you make, there is an individual universal or something doing the work of making that predicate available to the object. That's pretty bizarre. Not that that view doesn't exist, but that's, even though I don't like parsimony, that's probably a case where you and I would shake hands and agree. Okay, that's a little too flamboyant for me. But I really do. It's hard for me to understand. Like earlier, you made a distinction between metaphysical and conceptual conditions, and it just seems to me that hey, these conceptual conditions may not be like reducible to questions about like does space exist? You know, that's maybe more of like a nomological or ontological or whatever question. But whatever the conceptual condition is supposed to be, I'm not super clear on the distinction. It just seems to me that it's going to involve metaphysical questions like, do these things have a common property? And the way I can make, so I've actually spoken to other people about this, and it seems to me, hey, the strongest version of an argument like you're making is something like a meta regress argument. Like if I wanted to attack my view, I would do this whole turtles down comment that you made something to that effect a moment ago. That like when we go to speak of God, we pass the buck of the predicate onto some kind of mediating work. But then when we go to analyze that mediating work, we got to pass the buck yet again to more mediating work because even that mediation is not right. So you got to like this meta regress problem where in order to like classify these individual statements, the class itself can be analyzed and it shares the problem of needing a class. And then that class needs a class and so on and so forth. And each one just keeps multiplying the issue. But it seems like there's a very simple way to get around this. And the simple way is just to say that, hey, we didn't, the assumption of that kind of argument is that you need a common property to have the class. If you start with that assumption, or maybe you think that that's known, but if that's the claim that's on the table, that comparing things or using common predicates or things standing in intentional relation, whatever it is, if you think that those things require a common property, just on the face of it, hey, yeah, of course, there's all that. Just it becomes so obvious that this analogical predication is problematic.
Right.
It's just when you take that away, then it seems like instead of it being meta regress all the way down, rather it's, hey, no, the one act of condescension is sufficient to act as the truth maker of the intentional relations all the way up.
So okay, yeah, I think you're addressing an argument that I would somewhat consider unfair for the reasons that you're outlining, which is, and this is why I'm trying to offer like a different sort of approach. So yeah, it is the case that you get into this infinite regress of analogies all the way down, so to speak. And if somebody says, okay, but it's also a further assumption that like it's like saying there has to be a first moment of time, but time is infinite, right? And so those things are inconsistent. So if you said there has to be some univocal predicate at bottom here, and you're agreeing there isn't, then that's like unsatisfiable pair and so on, right? And so I'm not just trying to assume that you need that element of univocality. I'm trying to argue for it on the basis of this other argument. That's kind of like the approach that I'm taking here, is to not just do the typical regress, but to actually show that there's this other independent consideration to think that some element of univocality is needed, and it has to do with these the structures of these intentional relations, and the fact that it has to be true of both relata that they stand in the relation for the relation to be true, or to form the relation at all. And so again, it's like a minimal criteria for it to be true that it's the case that the two relata stand in the relation. Now, I think again, like we went into like, well, what if they just stand in the relation in a different way, quote unquote? there's still going to be something that's going to be held common there, which is that while they stand in the relation in a different way, we could assign some adjectives. We could say one stands in the relation in a spooky way, and the other one stands in the relation in a funny way. But at the same time, it's still just going to be true that we can strip those modifiers back and say, well, it's true that they both stand in the relation. And if you think that's not univocal, right? Again, I gave the point where now we just fix the meanings when applied to each of the relatum, right? We say, well, the meaning that you have in mind for A, it's false for B. The meaning that you have in mind for B is false for A, right? And so there isn't a pairing where it's true for both. And so there isn't a relation, right, that they stand in. There isn't a singular relation that they stand in. I mean, it's hard to say that even these other cases could make sense, right? Because if you don't have both of the relata, there really isn't a relation at all. But hopefully the illustration makes sense to say that, like, look, you have like on and off switches, right? It's like the meanings are not the same when applied to A and B, right? And so if we hold them fixed, and then we ask the question, well, the meaning we have in mind for A, does it apply to B? No. The meaning we have in mind for B, does it apply to A? No, right? And so then it's not clear how you can say, if you affirm that there is some particular individual relation that they both stand in.
Yeah. So when you say meanings, you have in mind propositions there. So it seems to me like you're saying, hey, the proposition that describes A as in relation is false when applied to B. But that just seems strange to me because for two reasons. One, it seemed like earlier in the conversation you agreed that, like, hey, if we apply different predicates to different objects, they're going to be falsified. So, like, if two people are standing in the relation as follows, they're inside the house, and I say Johnny is in the front of the house, and then I try to say Bob is in the front of the house, that's going to be false because Bob is on the other side of the house.
Well, but what is this?
But that doesn't seem to falsify.
I don't think this is the same. This isn't really a relation, right? This is like where you're saying that in the house predicate, both satisfy it. So you have a meaning in mind for in the house, and was it Bob and whoever? they both satisfy.
Make up names.
Now again, like I said, like you could add adjectives. You could say the front of the house, and that may be true of one and not of the other, but in the house is true of both. But that's not really analogous, TM, because that's not a relation so much as it is just applying the same predicate to two different things.
I guess I don't see the difference. It just seems to me that a relation may be like a special case of that or something. But I mean, the relation God is in R and B is in R, or A is in R, and C is in R, something like that. I can't keep track of the variables. It's just going to be the same thing as like saying this ball is red and that ball is red. I don't really think there's any big difference as far as the question, at least, what makes those propositions true. There may be other metaphysical questions about what makes relations and those predicates different, but the question about truth makers isn't going to change in the slightest.
Well, you might want to think of something like, say we're walking single file and I say Jimmy is in front of Sully, now we have this like is in front of relation. That's a two-part relation where I am one of the relata, you are one of the relata. And we want to say, what you basically want to say here is that when I say that I am one of the relatum of that relation, that like in front of relation, it doesn't mean the same thing as when I say you are one of the relatum of that relation, right? And then it's unclear now if I fix the meaning, right, to say that I am standing in that relation, it doesn't mean the same thing as so it's false to say that you're standing in that relation. So it's going to be false to say that you are in front of me, right? Do you see how that follows through, or I can like unpack it a little more?
Yeah, but so let me give you two. I'm sorry if this takes a little longer, but let me give you two ways of thinking about this further, because I'm still not seeing the connect. So with respect to like standing in front of someone, it just seems to me like you can bake into the equation the order of them, right? So they both stand in the relation R, and R is just from Jimmy's perspective, Sully's in front or whatever, right? You can just involve in the relation enough data to get rid of there being falsified one statement about one and about the other. It's just going to be true about both of them that they stand in that relation that I just outlined. And in the same way, like going back to God, I can just say, well, they both stand in the relation, namely, God makes this true via condescension that this tells you something about him that we can use such that we can use the predicate of him, right? I can just bake it back into the equation, that relation in full spelling, and then that's just going to be true of both. With it will have the same language meaning, but it will not
Well,
have.
okay. Let's make it a little bit more of a specific case, right? So you're saying God condescends, right? So let's take that as the predication. That's going to be A, right? In all those arguments that I was giving, right? Now you're saying God condescends is about God, right? It's a statement about God, or it's a thought even about God. If we wanted to strip the linguistic baggage away, you could just say you're thinking that God condescends, you know. And you could think that in many different languages. You could, potentially you could think that apart from any language. But the point is that there's this relation that has to hold if you want it to be the case that that thought is about God. Now you could have that thought, right? And maybe it's not about God, right? I mean, that's going to undercut the content of the thought to an extent.
Well,
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry, but I was just gonna say, but the relation is the condescension.
Well, in this case, what I'm saying is that it's your thought or your predication, which is about God when you say or think that God condescends, right? And so now we're saying that there's something true of this thought or predication that is also true of God, which is that they stand in that relation, that aboutness relation.
Right. That which is to say, when spelled out, something like the thought and I think better, the proposition and God stand in the relation, namely, God does this special work that makes the proposition true and about him. But there again, like that just bakes into the equation the thing that does away with um, there being
Yeah,
some
but
like doubt about.
it's okay to say that God's the one that makes it true, right? But it doesn't really address the issue, which is that what he's making true is that there's something true of him that's also true of your thought or the proposition or the predication or whatever you want to call it, right? That's what he's making true. So it's almost like he's making the thesis false. that's kind of the point. And then the further question, like I asked earlier, is like, why couldn't he make it so that you could univocally predicate of him?
Well, I think I'm really confused by that because I feel bad because like I'm not trying to be pedantic or maybe I missed something silly, but I just feel that that's to lose track of what the theologian is making in his analogical thesis. The theologian isn't saying that there are no truths about God, which aren't I don't even know. I've already lost track of how you put it, but it's not to say that there are like there's no propositional content shared between God and other things or something like that. It's just to say that the truth makers are different. It has everything to do with the
Well,
truth makers. It doesn't matter what the propositions are.
I think so. The point here is this. I think I broke this down a little bit earlier too, where we're saying like if we're understanding propositions to be formed by objects and predicates, that the point about analogical predication, if you're taking a sort of, at least with respect to the sui generis properties that God has, you're taking a sort of stance that they can only be predicated of analogically. What that means is that if God is the object forming the proposition with a certain predicate, that predicate, if applied to if that proposition that's formed there is true, then if you took that same predicate and applied it to any other object, it would be false. Right. And also any predicate assigned to another object, which forms a true proposition, when assigned to God, would be false.
Yeah, I'm a little confused by that. So yes, if you take, say, like God's aseity or something, which is taken to be sui generis, and you say that a dog is a say, that would be false. If
Yeah,
you say
that's
that,
right. But the point that's targeted here is a little bit more direct, which is to say that when you say that God is a say, right? That statement is a statement about his aseity, right? So his aseity stands in the intentional relation, and that statement or thought stands in the intentional relation in order for it to be about him and about his aseity, right? And so that part is true. Now it's true of his aseity that it stands in the relation, and it's true of the thought that it stands in the relation, right? And again, like the whole point is that that has to be univocal, right?
if by that you mean the relation or the standing in relation on part of the two objects um, has to be made true by common metaphysical features. If that's what you mean by univocal, which is what philosophical theologians mean by it, then I would just disagree. But and the controversy just comes down to whether or not that premise has good or bad reasons for or
Well,
against it.
I mean,
But
so I don't, I don't know why. Um, I don't know I don't really understand this point about common metaphysical features, because it could just be the case that like it's true that the thought stands in the relation and God's aseity stands in the relation, and yet God just makes that true. Like God's the truth maker behind those statements, right? Those propositions, I should say. He makes them true, right? And that's fine, but it doesn't break away from this question about univocality, right? The question about univocality has to do with the predicate being assigned to two different objects. In this case, like one of the objects is God or God's aseity, and the other one is the thought.
yeah, so I'll be honest here. We might be going around in circles. So I'll say this, and then feel free to challenge me on whatever, or we can go back and touch on something if you want to. But I'm sort of happy to rest my case in just saying that really think that the way you're approaching the topic of analogy is so different from the way that historical Christians have, that there's kind of a language. We're almost like talking past each other when we get to the issue of truth makers every time. Because to me, the whole point was to avoid truth makers of common metaphysical features. So when you express like being mystified by my preoccupation with that, I'm scratching my head going, well, but wait a second. That was like the whole point of analogical predication, was to avoid common metaphysical features, not to avoid propositions
Okay.
that express. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Okay. So maybe we can wrap it up shortly because we've known for a little bit now. But um, so when we're talking about common metaphysical features, I'm not quite sure what's going to qualify and what's not. And this is kind of why I went into like a potential nominalist route with respect to the relation, the way that we're thinking about that. But if it's God that makes it true, right, and He's the truth maker, that's okay. Like I don't have any issue with that. The idea is that to stand in this relation may not be something that carries like metaphysical baggage in a stronger, like maybe Platonistic sense or anything like that. But to say that the truth maker is held in common, I mean, if the truth maker is God, right? When we say God's property aseity, let's say we had the thought about God's aseity, right? We could say that God's aseity stands in this relation, and God is the truth maker, and also the thought stands in the relation, and God is the truth maker. As far as like the metaphysical similarities, I mean, if you think that something being true is a metaphysical feature or entity of some kind, then you would have to affirm that here. So I'm a little bit like puzzled by going to these like obscure sort of like metaphysical features, and I'm not sure how they fit into again these like statements about relations or abstracta on your view and things like that. I feel like the truth maker is just going to be God. So it's kind of why I've tried to avoid this truth maker conversation a bit. I don't know that it advances the dialectic at all, but
Yeah, that's totally fair. But it does mystify me, is the best I can do, and I feel that I'm in a state of paralysis to address you rather than hypothetical speculations about what you might mean, just because the only things I can come up with to make sense of what you're saying, most of the time you're saying I'm not really getting it, and I respect that. You're no dummy. You're a smart guy. So I'm like, okay, well, what's going on here? But on the other hand, like as far as the only things I can come up with, there are, at least in one case, very straightforward answers. And another, like, it takes us down the route of either the question like, what are the conditions whatsoever for intentionality to obtain, or the less philosophical, more theological question, like what does God need to do to explain or account for propositions being possessing that intentional property about him. So yeah, with that said, like I guess I'll end just by saying that as far as the metaphysical question is concerned, one concern I have is that it seems to me like when you do go down the rabbit trail, as you think of it, of abstracta and concreta and how they're related and how the world is predicatable and all that kind of stuff. It seems to me that Christianity does a really good job of making univocal predication possible. That, hey, the reason why we can say I've got a hat on my head is because I've got a common notion of hats and space and human heads and all this other kind of stuff going on. But if you take God out of the picture, like what are we really talking about there? Like, well, what is the unifying element in the universe that makes two individual things warrant the classification hat? What's going on in the world that makes objects warrant something like a spatial relation rather than just arbitrarily cutting up bits and pieces of our phenomenological expanse at any given moment, the horizon of our experience? It just seems to me like a really big factor going on in the background here is that, hey, if you stop to look at that metaphysical question about abstract and stuff, part of the strength of this theory is it is because of analogical predication. It is because God creates this world, condescends, enters it, takes on things in it, and speaks to us on our own level, if you will, that we then stand in a position to know and have access to a world that is ordered by him, and we can talk about all these common properties. So it seems to me like there is a waiting kind of like reverse reductio. Like I appreciate that you're trying to have a fair reductio that avoids like some of the more like old hat common properties objections. It seems to me that there's kind of a reverse argument rearing its head in the background that like, hey, wait a second, like for nominalism, say, there's kind of like this problem of how we unify our experience, how we have classes and common properties and things like intentional relations in the first place. How do we have those without God? So yeah, just wanted to mention that.
yeah, and I actually would be happy to do a debate geared towards that. We'll do like we'll do the reverse of this debate at some point. And you can target me on nominalism if you'd like. And yeah, I guess I'll just give this as like a closing remark, without like getting back into the meat of it. It's just to say that I think if analogical predication or like sort of theses that say that it's all you can really do with respect to God, even if they were to fail, even if my argument goes through, I don't think it like falsifies Christianity. This is something that I spoke to Nick about before the debate, that I don't think you need to maintain this thesis to maintain theism or Christian theism. So, and I do think, sure, that there's an apparatus for addressing, the problems about universals within Christianity. I think that there are some issues with those theories as well, but sort of another topic for another time, I guess. Yeah, and so I won't rehash my arguments because I feel like I restated them a few times. And I think I got the opening as well. So I'm happy to leave it there.
Yeah, and I would like to thank you for coming on and talking, man. I do think you stated those clearly, even if I have my contentions about whether or not they land or not. They are very well stated, and I appreciate your candor. You're a good guy to talk to. So
No problem, man. Yeah, always love talking to you, Jimmy.